The Garbage King. There was no light in the shack, none at all, except when the moon was shining. Mamo could see the chinks of it then through the gaps in the corrugated iron roof. But the moon wasn't out tonight. Mamo shivered, pulling the ragged blanket over his head and huddling against his sister's warm body. Tigus had been facing away from him, but she turned over to lie on her back, the bare straw mattress rustling as she moved. He knew she was awake. He knew her eyes were open, and that she was staring up into the pitch darkness. "What are we going to do?" he said. "I don't know." It was a week since their mother had died. Mamo hadn't felt much about it. Ma had either been sick or drunk for as long as he could remember, and he kept out of her way if he could, scared of her sudden, violent rages. Tigus was the person he loved. For years, when he was little, she staggered around with him on her hip, though she was hardly more than a toddler herself. She always looked out for him, saw that he was fed, picked him up when he fell over, and screeched at anyone who threatened to hurt him. "You're not going off, Tigus, are you?" he said, his stomach suddenly contracting. "You're not going to leave me." "I don't know," she said again. A black hole seemed to open up in front of Mambo. He wanted to push her, to force her to make promises, that there was a note in his sister's voice that he never heard before. It shivered him up. His skin was prickling all over. "The rent's due next week," she said. "It's 50 burr. How are we going to find 50 burr?" 50 burr. Mama had never seen so much money in his life. What'll they do," he said, "if we can't pay? What do you think? They'll throw us out." "Where will it go?" "Oh, shut up, Mama. How do I know? Work it out for yourself." The sharpness of her voice shocked him. It made him feel even worse. He didn't dare speak again. "I'll go to Miss Fardaw tomorrow," Trigus said at last. "She's got me to deliver stuff to her customers last week. She might give me a job. I could sleep in the shop." Mama swallowed and moved abruptly away from her. "I wouldn't go without you, though." He could hear the uncertainty in her voice, and his fear turned to fury. He rolled right away from her, taking the blanket with him and clenching his fist. "Well, what do you want me to do?" She sounded angry herself. "Work in a bar, paint my face up, and do it with the customers around the back? What else is there?" He hadn't thought about it. He assumed they would go on like before, and somehow Tigus would do what their mother had done, rustle up the money for the rent each month and scrape together enough each day for something to eat. "I'll work," he muttered. "I'll get a shoe shine kit." She snorted. Who's going to pay for a shoe shine kit? And how will you get a pitch? You know how those boys fight over there. You won't stand a chance." He stiffened his fingers into his ears. He couldn't bear to hear any more. Trigus pulled at the blanket and he rolled back towards her so that it covered them both again. The old straw and the bare mattress beneath them rustled as they moved. "If we're not careful," Trigus said, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, "we'll end up on the streets." The sun had come up at last, bringing warmth after the cold night, and the smoke from thousands of breakfast fires all over Addis Ababa spiraled up into the bright morning air. Mamo pulled at the piece of the sharp-edged corrugated iron which formed the door of the shack. It creaked open, and he stepped outside into the narrow lane, blinking at the bright light. He stood uncertainly, watching people hurry off to the day's work. He ignored the crowds of chattering school children in their bright blue uniforms who who carried piles of crumpled books under their arms. He'd only gone to school for a couple of years, and he left for good ages ago when he was 8 years old. There had been no money since then to pay the fees. He'd long since forgotten the letters that he began to learn there. He was more interested in the adults. There must be someone among the clerks in their cotton drill suits, the mothery women off to the market, and the young secretaries and shop girls with their bright knitted sweaters. Among all these people, there had to be someone who would help him, who would know what to do. Trigus had been gone for at least half an hour by now. She washed her face and hands, tidied her hair, and tried to scrub some of the stains off of her old skirts. Then she had gone off to see Miss Farida. He could tell, watching the stiffness in her back as she walked away from him down the stony lane, that she was tense with nerves. Usually, Mambo went down to the street corner in the morning. He knew some of the boys that hung around there. They spent long hours commenting on passers-by, or playing games on the chipped old board game, or begging off someone well-dressed who walked past. Sometimes he went the other way, to the music shop. He'd sit on the wall outside, drinking in the melodies that poured out through the open door, singing along with them under his breath. Today, though, he felt too anxious to go anywhere. He realized suddenly that he was hungry and went inside. Tiggis had left some bread wrapped up in a plastic bag on the only shelf in the shack. He reached up for it, then poured himself some water from a jar in the corner. He sat down on the little stool behind the dead ashes in the hearth, which was in the middle of the earth floor, and began to eat. The light streaming in through the doorway was suddenly blocked out. Mamo looked up and saw a silhouette of a man. It was impossible to make out his face against the glare outside, but Mamo knew at once that he was a stranger. "Hello," the man said, stooping under the low lintel and stepping inside. "Are you Mamo?" His voice was high and light, almost jaunty. Mamo nodded cautiously. "Where's your father?" the man said. Mamo could see him properly now. He was wearing a suit jacket over a green and brown striped shirt, and his shoes were made of leather and well shined. When he lifted his hands, a big watch on a loose bracelet strap slid up to his wrist. "My father?" Mamo repeated, puzzled. "He's dead, I think. He's in the army years ago." The man smiled. His face was thin, and his lips were twisted into a faint scar that ran down his cheeks. His eyes were darting around the inside of the shack. "Who are you, anyways?" Mamo said. He was beginning to feel uncomfortable. The man turned and smiled at him again, and it broadened. "I'm your uncle. Don't you know me? Your mother's brother, Murga? Didn't she tell you about me?" "No, she never said." Murga had crossed the floor with 2 strides and was running his eyes along the shelf. "Where did she keep her things?" "What things? She didn't have any things." Murga bent down and lifted a corner of the mattress. "Don't get cheeky with me." His voice was hardening. "Her radio, money, gold jewelry, anything. Don't tell me this is all she had. 1 mattress, 1 stool, 1 blanket, 1 water jug, a couple of pans, and a spoon and glasses." "I told you," said Mambo, backing towards the door. "She didn't have anything, nothing." Who's gonna pay me back then?" Murga straightened up and stared down at Mamba. "Pay you back for what?" "The money I lent her." "What money?" "Last month. She came and begged 100 burr off of me." His eyes had shifted sideways. "He's lying," thought Mamba, and took another sideways step towards the door. Murga's hand shot out and caught his wrist. He smiled again, and the hardness left his voice. It was soft again, affectionate almost. "Look," he said, "it's all right about the money. You're only a kid. I don't expect you to pay it back. I didn't come about that anyways. I want to help. I want to help you, see? I'm your uncle, and I want to see you right. What are you planning to do? now that she's gone. Mamba breathed deeply with relief and felt his shoulders relax. He's been wrong to be suspicious. This man was family, a relative, someone he could trust. I don't know, he said. Get a shoe shine kit, maybe? Murga laughed and shook his head. Polishing shoes? Nah, you can do better than that. I'll get you a job, a proper one. Decent food and nice people. What do you think about that? Marba's heart, which had weighed heavily inside him since he woken up that morning, suddenly felt lighter inside his chest. This was like a miracle. He had been looking hopelessly at the passers-by only half an hour ago, dreaming of a chance like this, and it had walked right through the door. You mean it? You really can get me a job? Where? What would I have to do? You'll see, Murga said. Come on, I'll take you there now. Quickly, worried in case this heaven-sent stranger would change his mind, Mamo reached into the corner behind the water jar and pulled out his shoes. They were nearly too small for him, and he didn't bother to wear them most of the time, but they'd make a good impression, maybe, on his new employer. He put them on, tied the laces, and stood up. Murga was looking at him critically. How old are you? 10? 11? I don't know. 13, I think. Bit small for your age, aren't you? Mama tried to straighten his back. I'm strong, he said anxiously. I could carry a good load. All right, come on, Murga took the last look around and shook his head. What a dump. Mamba's heart was beating fast with excitement as he followed Murga outside. He pulled the door shut on its protesting hinges and fixed the padlock. Murga was already setted off up the narrow lane when Miss Hannah came out of the little house next door. Are you all right, Mama? She asked kindly, hitching the baby who was tied to her back farther up towards her shoulders. Yes, my uncle's come, Mamba said proudly. He's got me a job, and we're going to go see about it now. Your uncle? Miss Hannah looked at Murga with surprise. That's good. I hope it works out. Come and tell me about it tonight. I'll have you some supper for both of you if you like. Mamba! Murga had walked on and was calling back sharply. Tell Tigges she comes back before I do, cried Mamba, and they ran after Murga into the lane. Who was that? Murga asked when at last he caught up to him. Our neighbor, Miss Hannah. She's really kind. Began Manga. And Tigges? Who's she? Mama's eyes widened. My sister, don't you know? Of course, I've forgotten. Murga looked pleased. How old is she? Older than me. 16, maybe? Where's she? She went to look for a job this morning at a grocery store. Miss Farava? That'll do. Stop chattering. Mama had been feeling more and more expansive. His feet pinched as they were in his old shoes, skipping lightly over the stones. Questions were boiling up inside him, but he kept them to himself. Rosy dreams were flowering in his mind. Perhaps he'd be working in a pastry shop, one with brightly painted fronts, and he'd wear a little bow tie and serve customers with those luscious cakes and streaming cups of coffee he so loved to smell as he passed them through the open doors. Or perhaps he would be in one of those furniture making places, and he'd learn to make beds and chairs like the ones displayed on pavement. More likely, he told himself, trying to be sensible, he'd be a porter in the market. Well, he could manage that. He was strong, whatever his uncle thought of his size. It wasn't long before he was away from the familiar streets and lanes where he'd always lived, and a little shot of anxiety began to sprout up in his chest. How would he find his way home? He began to look carefully around the landmarks, noticing big buildings, colorful signs in shop windows, and brightly flowering shrubs hanging over fences. Is it far? He said at last, looking timidly at Murga. A bus roared past at that moment, belching out clouds of black exhaust, and Morgan didn't appear to hear him. Instead, he grabbed Mamba by the arm and propelled him against the road. To his surprise, Mamba found himself in a crowded, noisy bus station. Perhaps I'll work in the office, taking the ticket money, he thought, his excitement rising again. Or maybe we're going right through here to the garage over there, and I'll be the boy who does the petrol pumps. He followed Murga through the ever-thickening crowd, dodging between groups of large, long-distance passengers and their bulging bundles, trying not to bump into peanut sellers and ticket touts. It happened so quickly that Mamba had no time to react. One moment, he was squeezing past a big red and gold bus, half defended by the throbbing of the engine, half deafened by the throbbing of the engine, and the next moment he felt Marga's hand close like a vice on his collar, and he was being thrust up a stairs into the bus and pushed down the crowded aisle into a couple of seats at the very back. Marga pushed him down the aisle into the seat by the window and sat down beside him. Mamba turned a shocked face towards him. He couldn't understand what was happening. He was only aware of the frightened, cold feeling that was growing in the pit of his stomach. "Where are we going?" he said. "This isn't an Addis bus. It's going out of the country. Where are you taking me? I want to get out of here. I want to go back to Tigis." But Murga's grip was tighter than ever. He was holding Mamba down in his seat. Now he thrust his face right into Mamba's, and Mamba smelt for the first time stale alcohol and a wolf of old tobacco. "Want to make a fuss?" he hissed. "If you do, I'll tie your hands and feet. I'll say that you're a runaway. You'll shut up if you know what's good for you. You said you wanted a job, and that's what you're going to get. You ought to be a damn grateful, you little shivering little beggar." The throb of the engine changed suddenly to a deafening roar. The conductor slammed the door shut, and it began to move, turning quickly out of the bus station onto the main road, out of Addis Ababa, away from everything and everyone that Mama had ever known. In another part of Addis Ababa, just off of the magnificent avenue, blazing with flowering trees that sweeps down the hill past the president's palace, another boy was sitting on the edge of a swimming pool in the grounds of a big hotel, dangling his legs in the water. All around, children were playing and splashing noisily. A boy from his school, lank and handsome, ran up behind him, leaping high into the air, his slim brown legs working like scissors, and landed in the water with a gigantic splash, swamping the boy and the other bobbing heads nearby. He surfaced and shook the water out of his eyes. "Danny, Danny," he chanted, looking mockingly at the boy. "Fat boy can't swim." Danny hunched his plump shoulders and stared down at the pool. The sun, sparkling on the water, shot out almost painful sparks of light. He looked sideways. There was a shallower pool nearby. Miss Screek, his little sister, was shuddering through it. She was wearing a pink bathing costume, and a pair of water rings clung to her arms like giant puffer sleeves. Her hair, tightly plaited all over her hair, was decorated with orange bobbins. "Look, Mama," she called out to the woman lying motionless nearby on a lounger under the striped umbrella. "I'm a crocodile." Danny looked over his shoulder at his mother. She had raised her hand and was waving it slowly at Miss Screek. She then tucked it back under the shawl that was wrapped around her shoulders. She must be the only person besides this crowded pool to feel cold on such a hot day. Zenny, the maid, had been sitting next to her on an upright chair. She got up quickly and went to the edge of the paddling pool. Don't disturb Mama, darling, she said. She said to Miss Greet, she's resting. Then she looked over towards Danny. Are you going to sit there all day? She called out loudly. Why don't you go in? Danny's face felt hot with shame. Reluctantly, he shifted his bottom closer to the edge, then forced himself to slide over the slide onto the water. He sank immediately and kicked out wildly. Mercifully, his feet hit the bottom of the pool at once, and he rightened himself. The water wasn't very deep. It only came halfway up to his shoulders. He began to move his arms, pretending to swim while keeping one foot on the bottom. He reached the far side of the pool and hauled himself out again. Then he took to his old position, sitting at the edge with his legs in the water. At least he was on the opposite side from Miss Greet and Zenny now. There were fewer children on this side too. Several European women were lying out in the sun, grilling their pink-oiled skin, their straw-colored hair looking brittle and stiff. Beyond them, the women in the shade tree, sat two Ethiopian women talking with their heads together. Danny let his mind wander away into a daydream. The sounds of the pool, the splashes, the squeals of children, the occasional trilling of a mobile phone, the burst of laughter from the adults loudly around the pool enclosed, and the murmur of waiters circulating among them faded away. He was standing in front of a burning building. Flames were shooting out of the windows, and smoke was billowing up in the sky. His father was calling out, "They're in there. Miss Greet and your mother. They'll burn to death." He was dashing into the building, fighting his way through the heat and smoke, braving instant death. His mother and sister were cowered in a corner. "Come with me," he said. "You'll be all right." He was picking Miss Greet up now and pulling his mother by the hand. As they emerged choking into the open air, his father ran forward. "Danny, you saved them!" He was crying. Then, as Danny sank into a dead faint in his father's feet, he heard a murmur. "I'm sorry, son. I misjudged you. That was the bravest thing I ever saw." His mother's name jerked him back into reality. "Ruth," he heard someone say. He looked around. Two Ethiopian women were looking across the pool towards where his mother lay in her lounger, wrapped in her shawl. The pool had monumentally almost emptied itself. The noise had died down, and he could suddenly hear their conversation quite clearly. "Yes, that's her. That's Ruth," one of them was saying. "Poor thing, look at her. You can see from here how sick she is." "What is it, cancer?" said the other one. "No, heart, someone told me. She needs an operation. They have to go to Europe or America for it. But that would cost a fortune." "Oh, there's plenty of money. Paulo's had done all right. I'm glad I'm not married to him, though." "I know. He scares me stiff. Those eyes. Every time I see him, I feel like I'm in court, up before the judge. He probably thinks poor little Ruth should pull herself together and stop melandering." "Oh, I don't know. My cousin's great friends with Ruth. She said she's absolutely adores him." She said he absolutely adores her, in his scratchy sort of way. He'll take her off abroad tomorrow for treatment. Only he's scared she won't survive the journey. That's that bad? Sad, isn't it? Yes, awful. "Waiter, over here. We ordered a club sandwich and a couple of Pepsis at least a half an hour ago." The pool had filled up with children again, and Danny couldn't hear the women's voices any longer. He didn't want to, anyways. What do those stupid cows know about his mom? They've only been gossiping. Women would say anything once they got going. He looked over towards his mother's lounger. Zenny was bent over her, holding out a plateful of snacks. Without being able to hear, he knew she was coaxing. He knew she was coaxing his mother to eat. Then he saw someone else. His father was walking in through the entrance to the enclosure, past the guard, who was standing at attention in his gold braided uniform, as if he was a soldier who had just seen a general. His father had spotted his mother at once and was walking towards her. His firm tread radiating power. His tall, spare form was immaculately dressed in white tennis clothes, and he was carrying a heavy sports bag from which the handle of a racket was protruding. Silently, Danny levered himself down into the water and pretended to swim again, making purposeful movements with his arms. Out of the corner of his eyes, he could see that his father had reached his mother's lounger and was standing still, looking down at her. Danny reached the side of their pool. He could hear their conversation from there. "Are you all right?" "Yes, fine." "What about your headache?" "It's